Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to So You Want to Start a Digitization Project. My name is Dr. Pamela Thomas. I'm the Bibliographic Grant Manager for the CMC. This morning, Kat Vanderberg will be presenting. The slides with the notes are already on the L2 event, so you can go grab those if you want to. And Kat will be answering your questions at the end of her presentation. So take it away, Kat.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Kat Anderberg. I'm the metadata cataloger here at the CMC, and today I am going to talk you through planning a digitization project. We have a lot of information to go over today, and I'll have lots of resources linked in my resource slides at the end. Our agenda for today is why we digitize collections, deciding what to digitize, copyright, public domain, and other legal and ethical considerations, digital images 101, selecting equipment, estimating costs, creating workflows, digitization guidelines, storage, digital preservation 101, and finally, resources and questions. So, why might we want to digitize a collection? There are many reasons why we might choose to digitize materials, but here are three of the most popular. We could digitize for availability so that users don't have to come into the library or archives to view materials. We could digitize for accessibility so that users can zoom in on small details or easily search across and within documents. I mean, you don't need to spend hours or days scanning through different files or books to find what you're looking for when you can search keywords in an online repository or PDF. Digitized documents can also be accessed by users with print disabilities through screen reader technology. Or we could digitize for preservation. Digitization itself is not a preservation act, but it can be part of a preservation plan. Having digitized copies of materials reduces the need to handle physically fragile items. If someone is interested in only the content as opposed to the material resource itself, a digital surrogate is an excellent substitute. Digitization also preserves the content of soon-to-be obsolete and rapidly degrading media, such as VHS and cassette tapes. Before starting a digitization project, it is important to clearly identify your purpose for digitization. Are you digitizing a collection of historic photographs to make them available online? Are you digitizing a collection of texts so that they can be searched more easily? Your purpose will help define other aspects of your digitization project. For example, if you are digitizing a collection of text documents so they can be searched and read by screen readers, the scanner you use wouldn't need the same resolution and file formats as what one would need to digitize a collection of photographs with small details in them. Defining the scope of your digitization project can be an intimidating step in the planning process, but it is necessary. As nice as it might be to digitize an entire collection of 10,000 photographs, that is a very large scale project, and the time and resources necessary can be unattainable for smaller institutions. The Illinois State Library Digital Imaging Program Best Practices includes this list of considerations when determining what collections or materials to digitize. The intellectual or cultural value of the collection to researchers, demand from current or potential users, the historical or geographic area covered by the collection, whether or not another institution has digitized the same or similar materials, the physical condition of the collection, whether the material is suitable for digitization, and if preservation work needs to be done prior to digitization. They also note that bound volumes need to be able to be opened to at least a 90-degree angle to be scanned, and large materials, such as maps, may need to be significantly reduced in order to display online, which results in a loss of fine detail and spatial context. You also must be aware of copyright. Any materials that are not in the public domain must have permission to digitize from the copyright holder. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So another one of my favorite resources for helping determine which collections or materials to digitize is this digital project prioritization matrix from the Digital Readiness Toolkit from Recollection, Wisconsin. A total score of 18 to 24 points indicates a high priority for digitization, while a score of 12 to 17 points indicates medium priority, and 6 to 11 points indicates low priority. Copyright and public domain can be confusing and overwhelming because copyright laws in the United States have changed so much over the years. For materials that were published or registered in the United States, any works published before 1930 are in the public domain, as well as any works published between 1930 and 1977 without a copyright notice. Works that were published without a copyright notice between 1978 and March 1st, 1989, and that were also not subsequently registered within 5 years of publication are in the public domain as well, as are materials that were published with a copyright notice between 1930 and 1963, but did not have their copyright renewed. For works that were published abroad, again, anything published before 1930 is in the public domain. Works published between 1930 and 1977 and that were published without compliance with U.S. formalities, such as copyright notice and renewal, and that are in the public domain in their source country as of January 1st, 1996, are also in the public domain, aside from some special cases. If a work was never published or registered, if the author died before 1955, the work is in the public domain. If an unpublished work is anonymous, it is in the public domain if it was created before 1905. If a work was unpublished and not anonymous, but the date of the author's death is unknown, it is in the public domain if it was created before 1905. Works that are not in the public domain generally require the copyright owner's permission to digitize. There may be some fringe cases where permission is not required because digitization is a new approach to the work's reuse, but this is a gray area, and if something is not in the public domain and you do not have the permission of the copyright owner, for example, if you cannot locate the copyright owner to request permission, you should seek out legal counsel before proceeding. The copyright owner can grant you permission to digitize their works. If the creator of the work is deceased, their next of kin would now own the copyright. Copyright is not the only question to address when considering legal and ethical concerns about digitization. Some examples of other considerations include privacy issues if materials provide detailed records of people's lives. Some materials might include PPI or personal protected information, such as social security numbers. Do the materials depict or originate from a group who may have cultural concerns about how they're shared? Do the materials depict culturally sensitive content? Do the materials contain any personally identifiable information? This includes personal phone numbers, home addresses, personal email addresses, financial information like credit or debit card numbers and bank account information, place and date of birth, religion and medical and criminal history, employment information such as performance ratings and disciplinary actions, mother's maiden name, investigative files, certain photographs such as graphic photographs that might impact privacy of the subject or of surviving family members, fingerprints, iris scans, voice prints, taxpayer or employee ID numbers, and truncated social security numbers or service numbers in casualty lists. Archives.gov has a useful flowchart for determining PII in records and at what date certain information may not constitute an invasion of privacy. and I'll have the download link for that in my resource slides. There's also a guideline called the 100-year rule, which tells us to assume that a person is alive until they are at least 100 years old if we have no other information about them, and we should redact personal information accordingly. I'm going to briefly go over some of the basics of digital images because the type of digital images you intend to capture will have a significant impact on your digitization project and workflow. Resolution is measured by how many pixels there are in an inch of a scanned item. This is called pixels per inch, or PPI. Higher resolution means pixels are more finely spaced, and lower resolution means that pixels are more widely spaced. You may have some experience trying to enlarge a digital photograph or scanned item and it becomes blurry and pixelated. When a digital image is enlarged, the pixels themselves are stretched. And the fewer pixels per inch, the more quickly the individual pixels become large enough to see with the human eye, and the sooner the enlarged image will look pixelated. Sometimes DPI, or dots per inch, is used interchangeably with PPI. DPI is technically used to refer to output formats such as printed digital images, but digitization guidelines and hardware manufacturers' documentation will sometimes use DPI to describe optical resolution. The total number of pixels in an image is determined by the resolution and the physical dimensions of that original. For example, an 8 by 10 inch photo scanned at 300 ppi results in an image that is 2400 by 3000 pixels, and a 2 by 2 inch photo scanned at 600 ppi results in an image that is 1200 by 1200 pixels. The more pixels in your digital image, the larger the file size will be. You want to digitize your materials at a high enough resolution to meet your project's needs, but you also want to digitize your materials at a low enough resolution that your file sizes do not become unmanageable. This can be a fine line to walk, but digitization standards and best practices can give you a lot of guidance. You can also do a resolution test where you scan an item at a few different resolutions to determine the smallest detail you want to capture in your digital image and compare the scans to find the resolution at which that detail is accurately captured. Image color is another factor that affects file size. There are a few different color options for digitizing images. Bitonal is black and white and has just 1 bit per pixel. A bit is the smallest possible unit of data. Bitonal is a great option for high contrast documents such as printed text. Bitonal scans are the quickest of all the color options, and they result in the smallest file sizes. Grayscale, as its name implies, is shades of gray. It has multiple bits per pixel and is most often used to digitize black and white photographs. Scanning in grayscale takes a little bit longer than bitonal scanning, and the file sizes are larger. RGB is color, and it has more bits per pixel than grayscale does. Scanning in RGB takes even longer than scanning in grayscale, and the file sizes are even larger. Grayscale and RGB are the preferred modes for archival quality scanning. You might also be aware of CMYK, which is short for cyan, magenta, yellow, black, and it's another color model. CMYK is the standard color model for offset printing, as it expresses all colors using inks of the 4 basic colors. CMYK is primarily used for printing, and it is device specific, so it should never be used for archival purposes. Bit depth is how many bits are in a single pixel. The more bits per pixel, the more distinct color tones can be represented by that pixel. This can also be referred to as color depth. For example, 16-bit grayscale can capture more shades of gray than 8-bit grayscale. As you increase the bits per pixel, the number of shades that can be represented by each pixel increases exponentially. Because of this, increasing the bit depth also increases the file size. As with resolution, Digitization guidelines and best practices can help you determine the appropriate bit depth at which to digitize your materials. There is no one correct file format for all applications. Once again, digitization standards and best practices can offer some guidance in determining what file formats are most appropriate for your project. One important factor in selecting file formats for your digitization project is compression. Compression is the process of encoding data in a way that uses fewer bits than the original data. There are two types of compression, lossless and lossy. Lossless compression reduces file size by identifying and eliminating statistical redundancy, so no actual information is lost. Lossy compression reduces file size by removing unnecessary and less important information in the data, which means that some information may be lost. Lossy compression can lead to generation loss, which is when a file becomes lower and lower quality with each subsequent copy or conversion of the file, sort of the digital equivalent of photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Lossless file types are larger than lossy file types. However, lossless compression can be reversed, while lossy compression cannot. It's a trade-off, and both types of compression are frequently used. Reproductions of lossless files will be identical to the original, while reproductions of lossy files will be lower quality than the original. Some common file formats are TIFF, which is a lossless file format and is often used for archival quality master images. JPEG, which is a lossy file format and is a great option for digitized photographs, especially photographs put online. JPEG is a good option for your access or user files. Access files need to be viewed and downloaded easily, so a smaller file size makes sense. PNG is another lossless file format, but it stores less data than TIFF, and unlike TIFF, cannot support multi-image files. And then RAW files are the unprocessed data straight from a digital camera, and these files are very large. One thing to keep in mind are proprietary file formats like Apple's .heic. Many portals don't accept proprietary formats, so it's important when you're selecting file formats that you're choosing formats that are suitable for your project. Having a consistent file naming system helps with system compatibility and interoperability, and it can demonstrate your ownership of the digital item. When planning file names, think long-term and consider the number of files that you'll be managing. It's also important to keep human error in mind. If a staff member is adding file names manually, how easy or difficult will it be to make a mistake? Your file names should be simple and straightforward. Each file should have a unique ID, and it's helpful to use leading zeros for sorting. Limit the characters in your file names to lowercase letters and numerals 0 through 9, and avoid punctuation except for hyphens and underscores. This reduces the chance of errors and keeps the file names simple. It's also good practice to keep your file names limited to 32 total characters, including the 3-character file extension. Most scanning software will allow you to specify a file naming convention. For example, indicating if you want to start at file 1 or file number 101. You can also add leading zeros to the file name, and there are free tools like Bulk Rename Utility for Windows that can help with file renaming after scanning is complete. There are many different guidelines for creating file names. 3 that I have linked in my resource slides at the end include North Dakota State Library's Digital Projects Toolkit, Wisconsin Historical Society's Best Practices for Naming Electronic Records, as well as Chapter 9 of the federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative, or FADGI, Technical Guidelines for Digital and Cultural Heritage Materials. Color management can be difficult because every piece of hardware and software that you use can introduce color bias. In order to ensure that you are capturing the most accurate digital representation of your materials as possible, it's a good idea to do your best to accurately compensate for color bias across your workflow. At the very least, you should calibrate the monitor that you will be viewing your images on. However, a more thorough color management system might include scanner calibration. Your scanner might come with a maintenance sheet that you can use for this. You might also consider purchasing a color target, which is a small card with a range of colors on it that the scanner scans during the calibration process. Using a color target can help you get accurate colors in your digital images. Color targets can be expensive, however, so they're not an appropriate option for every institution or project. Or you can also use histograms, which show a representation of the distribution of light in an image from 0% brightness to 100% brightness. The taller the peak at a certain point, the more pixels of that brightness are in the image. Most of the pixels should be in the midtones range. If you have large spikes in the far right or the far left, this is referred to as clipping, and it means that part of the photograph you're scanning is too under or overexposed for the scanner's sensor to capture any detail in that region. You can view histograms of your digitized images in Adobe Photoshop. OCR, or optical character recognition, is the process of converting images of words and letters into machine-readable text for searching. OCR can also be used to generate an exact typed transcript of a digitized text document, which is required for the Illinois Digital Archives. A document that consists of scanned images of texts is inherently inaccessible because assistive technologies cannot manipulate images. WCAG standards expect actual text to be made available instead of just images of text. You want to scan your materials at a high enough standard that the OCR process will result in a high level of accuracy. FADGI guidelines note that if you adhere to their 3-star rating imaging standard, then you will likely be able to produce high-quality OCR. Unfortunately, the actual condition of the original materials can also affect your likelihood of producing good OCR. No matter how well you scan your materials, sometimes you just cannot make up for materials that are highly faded, have printing errors, or have other damage. These materials will require more processing time after digitization to complete and clean up the OCR, or if necessary, create the actual text manually. So, we've decided what materials we're digitizing, we've wrangled copyright permissions and other ethical issues, we've identified what file types are appropriate for our project, we've settled on a file naming system, and we have a grasp on bit depth, file compression, color management, and OCR. Now it's time to look at what equipment we're going to use to create our digital images. FADGI recommends considering the following factors when determining what digitization equipment you will use: the types of materials you'll be digitizing, the sizes of the original materials, the quantity of each type of materials, the condition of the materials, the level of experience your staff has with digitization, the number of staff you have available for the digitization project, your budget, the physical space you have available, the duration of the project, and the end use of your digitized materials. Here are some of the pros and cons of 3 different options for scanners: flatbed scanners, sheet-fed scanners, and digital cameras. The pros for scanners are affordability, their ability to scan many different types of materials, high resolution, ease of use, and that many of them come with templates for digitizing slides, negatives, etc. The cons for flatbed scanners include that they are labor intensive, slow, they cannot digitize 3D materials, and they have difficulty with scanning materials that are larger than the scanner bed. The pros for sheet-fed scanners are that they are faster than flatbed scanners. Oftentimes, the resolution is as good as flatbed scanners, and it's very easy to incorporate automation into the workflow. The cons of sheet fed scanners are their unsuitability for many types of items, such as fragile materials, bound materials, and 3D objects. They are also more expensive than flatbed scanners, and they also have difficulty with larger materials. Pros for digital cameras are that they can digitize many different types of materials, including 3D and oversized materials. There are options for different lenses, and the image quality is generally very good. The cons for digital cameras are that higher quality models are still expensive, and there's a higher learning curve compared to flatbed and sheet fed scanners. When picking a scanner, some things to keep in mind are image quality, which is, as you might expect, related to the color resolution, related to the resolution and color representation. But it's also just about how accurately a scanner can replicate an image without inserting artifacts. Reliability. How often will the machine break and need repair, replacement parts, or just general maintenance? Performance. How fast is the cycle time or the time to create one scan? How long is the duty cycle, or how long can the scanner be expected to continuously run? Functionality. What exactly do you need the scanner to be able to do? Do you need to scan high volumes of materials? Do you need the scanner to produce edited images? And cost. How much will the scanner cost? How much will upkeep cost? How much will it cost to run? Are there additional software costs? How much training will your staff need to use the scanner? We are going to briefly rewind to resolution for a second. Some scanners are advertised with very high resolutions, but if you look closely, those resolutions are the interpolated resolution. Interpolated resolution uses an algorithm to guess what color and light values exist in the spaces that the scanner's light sensors cannot see. Make sure to choose your scanner based on its optical resolution and not its interpolated resolution, as only scanners with adequate optical resolution will produce accurate scans. The optical resolution of your equipment should exceed the maximum resolution necessary to capture the smallest necessary details in your materials. For example, a scanner with an optical resolution of 1200 ppi will be able to scan a 4x6-inch print at 600 ppi, but would be insufficient for scanning a 2x2-inch slide at 2000 ppi. Excuse me. As an example, here is the Brother DS640 scanner, which has a maximum interpolated resolution of 1200 dpi, as opposed to an optical resolution of 600 dpi. And you might remember that sometimes in advertising, the hardware will use DPI instead of PPI, just interchangeably. Okay. Here we have some pros and cons of doing digitization yourself or outsourcing it to a vendor. Doing it yourself gives you the most control over the project. You directly control the equipment, workflow, and what gets digitized when. You also own the equipment, so you get to control every aspect of its use. You can also decide between scanning everything in one marathon or splitting the project up into batches. Cons of the DIY route are that it costs money in the form of staff time. And on the next slide, I'll share a tool that can help you estimate how that translates to actual dollars. Another con is that you own the equipment. And therefore, if something goes wrong with the equipment or if a piece breaks, you're going to be the one who has to figure out how to fix or replace it. Going with a vendor is also an option. Pros are that they own the equipment and they have systems in place so that if something goes wrong with the equipment, they can often resolve and repair those quickly. Similarly to doing it yourself, you can also choose to digitize materials in batches, which can help spread out the cost. Cons for using a vendor is that it costs actual dollars that you have to pay them, and that some of the materials you'll be digitizing may be fragile and or irreplaceable, and you have to decide if you trust the materials to make it to the vendor and to be handled and digitized and made make it back to you safely and in no more pieces than it was before you sent it. This is the digitization cost calculator from Digitization Dashboard, which I have linked in my resource slides. It allows you to enter information about the size of your project and your project staff and returns an estimate of how much time it will likely take them and how much that time ultimately costs. Here, I've entered a project of 6,000 total scans with 2 staff people dedicated to the project, a librarian who is salaried at $50,000 per year, and a library assistant with an hourly wage of $20 per hour. Then there's this big page with a whole bunch of different processes that might need to be performed as part of the digitization workflow. I've identified here that the project will use a flatbed scanner, and the scanner will be performed by the librarian. Some of the other processes that you can enter here are the review of original materials, removal of fasteners, material sorting, rights review, quality control, digital image alignment and rotation, color correction, cropping, creation of descriptive metadata, and there's even an option at the very bottom to describe additional work that isn't addressed elsewhere in the form. Here are the side-by-side estimates for having the librarian and the library assistant each do 100% of the scanning. These estimates show the very base cost of creating the scans. No pre or post processing is included, only the time it takes to physically scan the materials. The calculator returns both a time estimate as well as the dollar cost estimate. Creating 6,000 scans on a flatbed scanner would take about 190 hours, and having the librarian doing the scanning would cost over $4,500, while having the library assistant do the scanning would cost over $3,700. Now let's briefly look at a more involved estimate. The total time for this project, still with 6,000 scans, but now with several pre and post processing tasks accounted for, is about 6,740 hours, and the total cost in dollars is a bit over 122,000. Unfortunately, the calculator doesn't return a total time and cost estimate per staff member, but you could go through the estimates line by line and calculate those pretty easily. The FADGI guidelines has a good outline of the steps in a digitization workflow, and they also include some sample workflows. The main steps, as listed by FADGI, are selecting materials, evaluating the condition of the materials, cataloging the originals if necessary, creating metadata, scheduling production, digitization prep, which includes removing staples and other fasteners and bindings, flattening bent or creased documents, and preparing your file naming scheme. Digitization. Set yourself up for success. Start with a sample batch and experiment to see what works for you and your project goals. Post-processing, quality control review, archiving, and publishing. Here's a sample digitization workflow from Chapter 3 of the Digital Readiness Toolkit. You may choose to do some of these steps as a batch. For example, you might make all of your access files at once. This chapter also includes some questions to ask yourself, though I've only listed 3 of them here. They also include links to a few sample workflows that you can look at and borrow from. One thing you might do is try digitizing a sample batch and build your workflow off what you learn from that. The important thing is to document your workflow once it's established. Here are some of the things you can look at as part of your image quality control. Is the image the correct size and resolution? Are the file name and format correct? Have you used the correct color mode and bit depth? Is the image skewed, off-center, rotated, or even backwards? Is the image pixelated or out of focus? Is there a lot of dust or other unwanted materials on the image? We'll never be able to completely eliminate dust, but we can try to reduce it as much as possible. Are any details lost in the highlights or shadows? Was the entire image scanned? Did anything get accidentally cropped off? Per FADGI, you should review at least 10 images or 10% of your batch for potential quality issues. There are several different digitization guidelines out there that you can use to help you determine the specs of your digital images. Here's an example from FADGI's guidelines for prints and photographs, and it lists out appropriate master file formats, access file formats, resolution, bit depth, color space, and color mode for all four of their performance levels, with 4-star being the highest quality. One-star imaging is appropriate for applications where the intent is to provide a reference to the original, or if there's simply no ability to scan to a higher level. FADGI recognizes that there are many reasons why scanning to a higher standard is not possible, and one-star conformance is an excellent starting point for anyone who wishes to begin standardized imaging, but may not have the necessary support, resources, or experience to scan to a higher rating. 2-star imaging is the minimally acceptable rating for most professional digitization activity. It is appropriate for applications where you cannot reach 3-star conformance, or in situations when 3-star conformance isn't necessary for the intended use of the digital image. 3-star imaging produces a very good professional image that is appropriate for most uses. You might remember that FADGI recommends at least 3-star imaging to return a high quality OCR result. 4-star imaging is the best imaging practical today, and 4-star conformance represents the current state of the art in digital imaging. Generally, 4-star conformance is an appropriate goal for small scope projects where such compliance may be more achievable. Here's an excerpt from Illinois Digital Archive's General Guidelines for Images. It specifies IDA's desired scan format, master file format, and access file format for multiple media types. Finally, here's an excerpt from the Digital Readiness Toolkit's guidelines. They list different media types and appropriate resolution with minimum and ideal resolutions, color mode, bit depth, file formats, and some additional details such as required OCR or recommended image size. Before you actually begin digitizing, you need to figure out where your files are actually going to live. Digitized materials, especially archival files, take up a lot of space. You can store them locally on hard drives, network drives, and local servers, or you can partner with a trusted organization to store off-site copies of each other's materials. Or you could contract with a vendor for cloud storage. Cloud storage is a great option for having one copy of your files in a different location than the others. Audiovisual Preservation Solutions published a guide of 9 things to consider when assessing cloud storage. Their considerations are defining requirements, vendor assessment, storage hardware management, data management, reporting and metadata, performance, security, disaster recovery, and end of service. The whole guide is linked in my resource slides, and it comes with questions to ask when thinking about each of the 9 considerations. You can estimate how much storage space you will need by multiplying your total number of files by an average file size and the number of copies you plan to keep. You can use the scans from your test batch to estimate your average file size. It's wise to add 5 to 10% of additional storage for additional files and metadata that you intend to store with the digital images. Once you have your digital images, you'll need to enact a proactive preservation plan. There's nothing worse than spending hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars creating digital images only to stick them on a hard drive somewhere and find out a few years down the line that they've become corrupted. Digitization is not by itself a preservation action. Digital files are, in many ways, more fragile than physical materials. Once, at a former job, I received a drive full of old oral history transcripts that had been typed up in the late 90s and left on the drive, and every single file was corrupted and unusable. Hundreds of transcripts, thousands of hours of work, now all needing to be redone. Having and following a digital preservation plan can prevent that from happening. Some reasons to have a digital preservation plan: obsolete software. As with my oral history transcripts, files created with an earlier version of a proprietary program like Microsoft Word cannot be opened in the current version of Word. Obsolete hardware and media. When's the last time any of us used a floppy disk? When's the last time any of us used a computer with a built-in disk drive? Accidental deletion or saving over the original. Viruses, physical and natural disasters. What happens if your server room floods or a blimp crashes into your offsite storage? Your disaster planning should include your digital materials, and I've included some disaster planning resources in my resource slides. Um, File corruption, and just to protect your investment. Some steps that you can incorporate into your preservation plan include fixity checking, which is making sure that files have not changed over time or become corrupted. Media migration, which is moving files from one media type to another, such as moving files from an older hard drive to a new one. Format migration, which is changing a file format from an older or less stable format to a newer or more stable or standard format. Be sure to document your policies and procedures for your digital preservation plan. For example, how should specific tools be used? How frequently should files be transferred, and what workflow should be followed? What should be done with old media once the files have been transferred? When should you migrate file formats? One rule of thumb is the 3-2-1 rule, which calls for having at least 3 copies of your files kept on at least 2 different types of media, with at least 1 copy stored offsite. Not everyone has the resources to follow the 3-2-1 rule or to even just maintain 3 copies of their files. So have at least 2 copies in 2 different places. You should also understand where your files are physically located. Are they on an on-site server, a cloud server? Where are the cloud servers located? Are your archival and access files in different places? Who has access to all your files? Are they on a network drive where anyone can access them? Or are they protected and only accessible by digital project staff and IT? It's extremely helpful to have an inventory of your digital collections and to keep it updated. Your inventory can include storage locations and the age of media, who has access to what files or media, total number of files and total size of the collection, and information about file formats. There is more information about creating an inventory linked in my resource slides. I mentioned fixity checking as a common preservation action, and checksums are a great way to make sure nothing in your files has changed. A checksum is an algorithm run on a file that produces a long alphanumeric string that is unique to that file, also sometimes referred to as a digital footprint. There are multiple algorithms you can use to create checksums, such as MD5, SHA1, SHA256, and SHA512. If even one bit in a file changes, the checksum will be completely different. You can calculate checksums when you receive digital files as part of your post-processing phase of your digitization project or sometime after quality control. Once a checksum is established, you can recheck them in the future, such as before and after every transfer or on a regular schedule. At a former job, we rechecked all of our checksums every December until we contracted with a digital storage company that would do it for us. There are several different checksum tools available. Some only document checksums, like Hash My Files, Droid, and Data Accessioner, while others will document and monitor your checksums, like MD5 Summer, Exact File, and Cores. I have just a couple more resources I want to share with you quickly. The National Digital Stewardship Alliance has 4 levels of digital preservation, which are a helpful resource for understanding, protecting, monitoring, and sustaining your digital materials. Finally, the Digital Readiness Toolkit from Recollection, Wisconsin includes digital readiness levels, which are a structured roadmap for organizations to plan and sustainably grow their digital initiatives. They have 3 levels or focus areas to help you prepare for and grow your digital projects. And here I have all of the resources I used and mentioned, as well as a few extras that I think might be useful as you're thinking about and planning your digitization projects. All right. And finally, we have a few minutes left for any questions. On the call today, along with myself, we have Barb Scobie, Dr. Pam Thomas, Mary Cornell, Eric McKinney, Ryan Rafferty, Katie Roberts, and Andrea Giosta.
Thank you, Kat. That was very informative. We do not have any questions right now. I have allowed people to unmute themselves if they would like to ask their question. And I'm going to post in the chat our evaluation form one more time for those of you who joined us later. We're always looking for feedback on our presentations, but also future topics. Okay, we have a question from Joel. You mentioned avoiding proprietary file types. Does that include PDF or EPUB for ebooks?
Ooh, that's a good question. PDFs are generally accepted by most repositories. So PDFs are generally okay. I'm not necessarily sure about EPUB. That's not a format that I've ever really worked with. But that is certainly something that I can look into for you if you'd like and get back to you.
Ruth asked, I'm afraid I entered late. Will the video be available? Yes, Ruth, we always send you the link through L2 for the recording. We should have that hopefully early next week. Okay. And as I said, the slides with the notes are on the L2 event. And you have to kind of toggle to get to the notes. So if anybody has any issues with that, you can send the CMC an email and I'll try to guide you through it. It's just a little bit trickier. And if you don't have your first name, last name, you can just go to the participant list and hover over your name and click on the ellipses, and please provide your first and last name. That helps me reconcile the L2 and the Zoom roster. And then next month, we will be doing Shall We Play a Game, cataloging games. So that's January 8th at 10 a.m. So if you're interested in that, please register in L2. And Eric and I will be co-presenting that one. So does anybody else have any questions about today's presentation? Again, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to ask your question verbally. Or you can use the chat box. If you don't have any questions about the content provided today, you can also ask us general cataloging questions, and we will try to answer those.
A question. This is Ruth Lindeman. I have a question. We are a very small community college. And even though I've been here a long time, the people who should have been taking on our archive materials didn't. And so I am trying to decide how to cope with things. And one of the biggest things we have is a bunch of scrapbooks that were done and which are rapidly
Deteriorating?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think they are that's sort of the first thing I see, having to try and design a digital project of some kind to cope with.
Yeah.
And preserve. Yeah.
But and I'm sorry because I was late, and
Okay.
so I didn't hear the very first part of this, but this is also really outside my wheelhouse. I've just inherited it, and suddenly it is my thing I have to do. And I really don't know sort of what should be my very first steps. I'm in the process of storing materials so that they're at least stored more properly. But
Hmm.
in terms of actually taking in the digitization portion of it, what would you say would be the very first thing I should try and focus on for those scrapbooks?
The very first thing would be, I mean, you've identified that digitization would be part of a preservation plan for these. Scrapbooks are a nightmare in terms of degradation. Um, and so, probably the next step after determining that, yeah, these are something you want to digitize would be um, making sure that there aren't any, necessary copyright issues with it. Um, and, it's, who created the scrapbooks, who owns them, and, what are your plans for the digitization? Um, and, um, you've kind of like done the first step already in terms of determining that, hey, these are something that are important to be digitized, um, specifically for preservation reasons. Um, and so, yeah, identifying if there's any copyright or other ethical concerns, and also determining, I just lost my train of thought.
But also considering whether they're going to do it there in house at the library or using a vendor.
That's something to consider. Um, and
The, the, I think that as far as the scrapbooks themselves are concerned, they are the property of the college, but they contain a lot of, like clippings of various
mhm.
paper things and stuff. So does each item then need to be evaluated or?
Um, Part of it depends on the age of it, and also this is where these fringe cases about the use of it are. Um, so like, are there's different questions about like, are you going to put these online versus we are having these scans in-house for researchers to come access as if they were like the physical things.
Right.
Um, and so then you would start thinking about, yeah, like what are the goals of the project? What do you need these digital images to do? Um, because certainly like having it as like a copy of the physical that is rapidly deteriorating. But again, that is this to be put online? Is this just to be made accessible towards researchers? Um, and then you would be able to start thinking about, okay, is this something that we could buy a scanner for? Is this something that we would need to contract with people to help us do? Um, so yeah, I mean, you kind of know your what, and you probably are starting to have a decent grasp on the why. And so then it's kind of working on the how and um, determining, okay, so we want these to be really good copies that people can look at and see the different details of. So we would need, um, a scanner to be able to do at such and such resolution. And that's something that the different guidelines I have linked in the resources can
Right.
help.
That part I have a sense of. I was just more, I really wasn't sure about what copyright stuff would be involved with something that was sort of a collection of copywritten materials by somebody else.
Yeah. If the things were, created like by the college or like, like if okay, so like if there's something like a school newspaper clipping, like the newspaper would own that copyright because it's their newspaper that they were putting out.
Right.
So evaluating different things like that. And I would, you know, the likelihood of there being, protected personal information in, an official scrapbook versus like a collection of personal papers, um, you might not run into as much as that. Um,
Mhm.
but something to be aware of as you're looking through them, preparing them to be digitizing if anything jumps out.
Right. Well, thank you. I realize that this is a particular problem, so I don't want to take up
Hmm.
much of your time, but thank you.
That was a good question. A real life scenario. Okay, does anybody else have any questions? No? Okay, well, thanks for attending, and hopefully we will see you next month, which will be next year. And hope you have happy holidays and all that jazz.